Samsung absolutely cooked with this component, doing so well in fact that the company has repeatedly used it in its best smartphones for the last 2.5 years. It's highly likely we'll see this next year, and despite that pointing towards stagnation, or maybe even complacency, it's actually due to hitting the mark so early on that the competition is still trying to compete. Before that, guys, really trying to hit 150,000 subscribers, so if you wouldn't mind hitting that button, it'd mean the world to me. Thank you so much. You guys know I am a camera snob, and a smartphone camera snob at that. I have gone on record saying that Samsung has generally played it safe for the last few years when it comes to the S series flagship camera setups. The ultra-wides have seen an upgrade in recent years, which is really good. The telephotos feel like yesterday's tech and not something I'm particularly impressed with compared to the competition specifically coming out of China. Like, some of those sensors are double the physical size. But one thing I've taken a recent fascination to is Samsung's 200 megapixel main camera because, well, sure, it's the S25 Ultra, which is the latest and greatest, but it's also in the S25 Edge that I carry around every single day, the S24 Ultra and the S23 Ultra. Yet there seems to be no sign of a big upgrade on the horizon, stagnation, or a touch of brilliance. It's called the ISOCELL HP2 and it was developed and manufactured by Samsung's own fab, so it's incredibly integrated right from the get-go. It's a 200 megapixel setup at 16384 pixels by 12288. It's a 1/1.3 inch rated size and is capable of recording video at 8K 30fps, Ultra HD 4K 120fps, and Full HD at 480fps. So it's a bit of a beast when you consider this thing is packed into a smartphone that's thin enough to carry around all the time, not have a ginormous camera bump glued to the back of it like many a Chinese phone has. The HP2 was built on the already impressive Samsung HM3 sporting 108 megapixels in a slightly smaller 1/1.33 inch package that debuted with the first Galaxy Ultra, the S20 model. Many reviewers were impressed with that crazy high resolution sensor, and the images that came from the phones it was in were a massive step up from what Samsung was putting into phones before. It was carried over into the S21 Ultra and the S22 Ultra before being superseded by the more powerful HP2. The sensor is about the same physical size as much of the competition this year, the sorts of sensors you'll find in the latest iPhone and the Google Pixel high-end devices. They're around that 1/1.3 inch mark, but the beauty of the 200 megapixel sensor is that it's able to capture more fine data and bin down to the sorts of image sizes that we're used to seeing, which default on most smartphones to around 12 or 12.5 megapixels. This is fine because actually we want as much dynamic range and so on as possible without losing heaps of quality in detail and, importantly, color information. Binning is great, it's a brilliant way to output really well-rounded images, and we're certainly doing a lot of that in the 200 megapixel setup. You can of course manually select 200 megapixels when shooting these photos with these phones. That's available right there in the app, you don't have to download a pro mode, and in most shots you do see a sharpness and detail boost when you do switch to 200 megapixels, particularly in busy shots where there's lots of micro contrast like foliage, and you come away with photos that do look a level above in raw perceived quality. But by sticking with the default 12 megapixel output, you tend to find increased dynamic range across the board, so there's more detail present in the shadows and the highlights at the same time. Honestly, sometimes it can make images look a little boring or flat, and you don't quite get the same kind of pop that some of the 200 megapixel photos give you. But to be totally honest, I think for most people this is absolutely fine. If you're looking for as much detail across the scene as possible, sticking with the bin mode is the way to go. Because the HP2 has a 24mm full frame equivalent lens, that's a f1.7 aperture, and it feels quite personal and immersive, like most other 1x cameras on the market. And as much as I like the 24mm focal length, I'm a big fan, I have been enjoying using the 28 and 35mm digital crops on other phones like Apple and OnePlus devices have in their first party camera app straight out of the box. It's quite annoying that Samsung doesn't have this built in because the sensor being 200 megapixels feels like there's so much scope for a bit of crop to match these kinds of trendy focal lengths. And it's something that could quite easily be added in a software update, so I'm just hoping that maybe for the next model they do add it in. That said, the experience of actually using this camera is that you're almost guaranteed to get a good shot, almost like that of the Pixel camera experience. There's a lot of detail across the entire board in a lot of these shots and in plenty of different lighting scenarios too. It's still a bit over sharpened than what I'd like from my photos. I tend to prefer a bit more of a natural look, which is something that you tend to get with the likes of the Leica, Hasselblad and Zeiss collaborations. The Samsung stock look can end up a little bit crunchy, particularly when you zoom in, since there's a crop on the sensor. Actually, this is one of the scenarios where switching to the 200 megapixel mode makes quite a lot of sense, because pinching or cropping beyond any kind of 2 times amount tends to reveal crunchiness with the binned shots that you don't get from the same 200 megapixel files. But because of mobile photography is full of computational processes, it's so heavy with the processing in general that you do tend to get kind of weird artifacts even if they aren't necessarily a softness. And that's just not something that you would normally get with a raw file from a purpose-built camera with a much larger sensor, even if the resolution is actually lower than 200 megapixels. That said, when you do take raw photos with the Samsung and you apply presets or really fine-tune the photo editing process, you can end up with final images that do look quite drastically different to the sort of thing you'd normally capture by double tapping the power button and snapping something in auto mode. You get character out of images that would usually require quite a bit of work to get looking decent, and I think it's actually worth it in many cases. When it comes to video though, this sensor and software combination is fantastic. I maintain my view that Samsung does the best video stabilization in any smartphone in its Ultra HD 4K 30 and 60p modes. It can take a hit in 8K where I think this camera just doesn't need to be shooting such high resolutions. Personally, I'm not sure we'll ever really need 8K, let alone in a smartphone in the next couple of years. The footage from any one of these modes is really solid and easily able to be used to build something more than just a quick clip of your pets or your kids. And yes, the Ultra HD 4K 120 is fantastic, though I'm not sure it's quite as good as it is at the lower frame rates. Because Samsung introducing log this year has been a revelation. Honestly, though it might not quite match the ProRes log colors in my opinion, my word does it get close. I'm a big fan of having log with a usable and accessible Rec 709 conversion, as it is present on Samsung's website. It takes all the guesswork out of making sure you're in the correct color space, which can be most of the battle with a lot of these log profiles on Android phones. I have not given this camera nearly the praise and the time that it really deserves, because it doesn't look as impressive on paper as what you'll find in phones coming out of China. It's not a 1-inch type, it doesn't have that massive rear camera housing that causes controversy, and because the HP2 has been around for a while now, it feels like the hype around it is completely faded. We almost feel so far removed from that launch that it's not been a headline spec of the S24 Ultra, S25 Ultra or the S25 Edge. It almost feels like a footnote in those device reveals over the last year and a half. Samsung absolutely cooked with the ISOCELL HP2 200 megapixel sensor, and as much as I have given the company some crap about not innovating each year, what they did with this sensor is fantastic work, and I am almost sad that I didn't run a phone with it in as my daily until recently. It's a brilliant setup. Now let's see if they can put that same kind of quality into a telephoto.